And again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, whatever it is where you are. As you know, I'm Tamar Grainer. This session is VFP tips and tricks. Just a nice, I don't want to say light way to start the day, but not something that's a big, that you have to get deep into one thing. I've been working with VFP and FoxPro before it for more than 30 years now. I've done a ton of writing and speaking about it. I'm one of the organizers of this event and of Southwest Fox. And just want to say that I'm always interested in hearing about new opportunities to work with people. Plan for today is lots of tips and tricks. The overall goal is ways to work smarter and better with VFP. And I've divided stuff broadly into two categories: ways to be more efficient in the IDE and ways to use the VFP language better. I want to say up front, we are not going to cover everything that's on the slides. And what we actually cover will depend on how the timing goes. And not everything that's in the paper is on the slides. That is, I have more to say than time to say it. I also want to say that in the IDE, I'm going to be talking only about stuff, pretty much only about stuff that comes in the box. But there is a tremendous world of things you can add to your VFP environment, mostly from VFPX. And the first tip is, if you haven't spent any time looking at what's on VFPX, it's time for you to do that. Okay, before we go on, I'm now going to turn my camera off so that you can see more of the screen and less of me, or none of me.
Tamar, you muted yourself but didn't shut your camera off. Wrong button.
That was fun. Okay, thank you, Rick. So let's try that again. The first way you make yourself work smarter and better is to set up VFP in a way that works for you. Step one is fonts and sizes. You have the ability in VFP to configure for pretty much anything except the actual menu, what font it uses and how big it is. You do that in the IDE tab of the Tools Options dialog. Let's switch over to VFP and Tools Options, IDE, and that drop down that you saw open on the slide, this says, which kind of windows am I talking about? And for the program files and text files, you can say what you mean by that. So if there are other things you use, maybe for some reason you want to open PDP files or something in here, you can do that. And for each kind, you click this button, you choose the font and size that you want, hit OK. And now I could hit the apply button to apply the changes that I didn't actually make. Or if I now switch here to another one, it's going to ask, do I want to save those changes? Sure. And now I'm looking at code windows, which is the method editors in the form and class designers. So that's how we set fonts and sizes for all kinds of windows, except for a few that can't be set here. Let's get out of there. The command window itself, you set its font and size by hitting Properties. And now I can set the font and size here. I'm not going to change it. Property sheet. No. You do by clicking up, right-clicking here, or down here in the text area, and choose font. Same deal, set the font and size. As you can see, I've done that here. I know lots of people hate Comic Sans. I really like it for certain tools. I want to go back to Tools Options for a moment. After you've made changes, If you just hit OK, they apply only to the current session. If you want to save them for the future, click Set as Default. Be aware that that's not just for the tab you're on, it's everything in the dialog gets set as your default for future sessions. So that's fonts and sizes. Next up, colors. You may want to set colors to make things more obvious to you, and there are a number of ways you can do that. First of all, in the property sheet, in that same context menu, you can actually set 4 different colors. The default and the one that's going to be used for everything that doesn't fit one of these categories is black, or matches your Windows settings. But you can set the color to use for ActiveX properties, the color to use for non-default, that is properties that have changed from whatever they were created as, for custom properties that were added at some level, and instance properties that were added at this level. And by the ability to do that means you can look at the property sheet and know where a property, event, or method comes from. I did not mean to hit that. Okay, where else can you change colors? In Tools, Options, on the Editor tab, you can set up what's called syntax coloring. You choose which piece of the syntax you want to change, and you set foreground or background or even font style. You can make things bold or italic. I know a bunch of people who like to make comments have a dark background and a light front, for example. Whatever you change, same deal, hit OK. It's for this session. Hit Set as Default. It's for future sessions. Also on this tab, we control something that was added pretty late in the game called Background Compile. When you first install VFP 9 and you start typing, you'll notice that whatever you type in the command window gets underlined, and then the underline disappears. That's Background Compile. What's going on is VFP is telling you whether what you've typed is valid at this moment. I like the red inversion choice. You have the underline, you have the gray, or you can turn it off. And it means that when I start typing, for example, I type M-O-D-I, and you may see that is pink. Pink means that it's a valid keyword, but I haven't yet completed the command. And if you go back, it's a little hard to see. At M-O, it's red. It's not valid yet. Mod is a command in FoxPro, so that's valid. And I'll let IntelliSense kick in. And same deal, I start typing command. And when I get to 4 letters, oh, now I have a valid command entirely, so it turns blue, which is my syntax color for commands. So it's handy. I wrote when this first was added that I thought that after a bit, we'd all turn this off. I keep running it, and I don't think that I pay conscious attention, but I'm pretty sure behind the scenes, my brain is noticing when something is valid and when it isn't. What else can we do about settings? If you've made changes in the Tools Options dialog, there is a way to see exactly what all your settings are. And you do that, Tools, Options, too soon. I need to open the debugger first. I'm just going to type debug. And now if I go Tools, Options, and I hold down the Shift key when I click OK, if I switch back to the debugger, the debug output window, which is incredibly useful and we'll talk about more later, contains all of the settings that were in that dialog. If they are FoxPro, if they can be set by FoxPro commands, you've got the actual commands: set talk on, set notify on. If they're registry settings, they're in here as comments. They are always in the same order. This means that if you have 2 machines that aren't behaving the same, you can do this on each machine, right-click, save as, save them to files, and then use your favorite comparison tool to compare them and see where they're different. It also means that if you've got a new machine and you want to configure it just like your current machine, you can do this, save as, copy that file to the new machine, and run it as a program in FoxPro. That'll give you all the ones that are FoxPro settings. It won't give you the registry settings, of course. To get those, you'll have to export from the registry and run that on the in Windows. That's in the paper. I'm not going to talk about it here. Okay, so once you have the machine configured the way you like it, then, or the FoxPro configured the way you like it, then you want to find ways to do things fast. I'm going to talk about a number of ways that you can set up shortcuts. So you type less, or you just, well, mostly type less, so that you can be more effective. The first is IntelliSense. IntelliSense is on by default since VFP 7. If you're one of those people who hated it and turned it off and never turned it back on, do yourself a favor and turn it back on and try again. And give yourself a couple of weeks to see if it helps. So we can control IntelliSense in the IntelliSense Manager. And on the Custom tab, we have all these shortcuts that are defined. For example, and I used this earlier, I don't think I actually typed it, MC. If I type MC space or MC enter, it'll get expanded to modify command. So I often type MC space, then I get the list of my most recently opened programs. Really handy. You can add your own here, and I've added a bunch. I took one of them out so I can demo it for you. A command I use all the time is browse last. So I've set things up so that BL is a shortcut for browse last. As I say, I took it out so I could demo. So now it's in there. And if we go to the top of the list, there's browse last. So if I come down here and I open a table like the Northwind customer table, type BL, I need it to return, of course. It just browses it the way I last did it. Really handy. I've added go top and go bottom shortcuts and the create and modify ones that aren't included in what comes in IntelliSense. The other thing you really ought to have is a standard comment script. So I have it set up that if I type TEG mod, I get prompted for the reason for this change. This one's a VFF demo, and it pops in a comment in this format. Really handy. Credit to Tony Feltman for suggesting the input box for the comment. What does that look like in the IntelliSense Manager? If I come back over to custom, they'll be near the bottom because they're alphabetical. Here's TEG mod. There's a script. And the script, which I leveraged from one that somebody else in the community wrote, that might have been Doug, receives a parameter to the Fox code object. This code says if we are in some kind of program window that isn't the command window, then this is a V type. And what I want to return is the result of the get text function. And down here, you can see I do that actual return. In get text, I grab the date, I parse it into its components, I prompt for the comment, I use text merge to build the comment. And this the tilde here tells IntelliSense and put the cursor there. And you saw that that works. I also have a to-do comment that's standard. I also have a version of this for a particular client where they use a particular comment format. There is tons more you can do with IntelliSense to make your life easier, but I am not going to demo any of that. That could be a whole session. And in fact, it was. Rick Schumer did a session on that last year and kindly allowed me to include his paper in the downloads for this session. So in the folder for my session, you'll find my paper and Rick's IntelliSense paper. What's another way to set shortcuts? The Toolbox. The Toolbox, when it was added in VFP8, rapidly became one of my favorite tools, and I've done sessions on it a few times. And one of the things it has is this text scraps idea, that you can set up text templates and drag and drop them into code. A few years ago, I was working on a project where people had not saved and restored the work area at the beginning and ending of each routine. So I needed to go through dozens of routines and add code at the top to save the work area and code at the bottom to restore it. If it had just been one thing I needed to do, I would have just stuck it on the clipboard, opened them one by one, and pasted. But I needed two things. Enter the toolbox. Pretend that this program where it says do something that changes the work area has a whole lot of code in there. But at the top, I have the code I need at the top to save the work area. And I can highlight that, and I can drag it into the toolbox. And there it is. I could rename that to have something meaningful. I'm not going to. I'm going to drag this other one in. And now imagine that I open some existing program. Here we're just going to pretend. Imagine there's all this code in here, this invisible code, and I can drag this at the top, and then I can scroll. You see me scrolling, but my pretend scrolling, and drag and drop that at the bottom. And now I can go through dozens, hundreds of programs quickly doing that without having to come into them twice. Basically, what it's given me is multiple clipboards. Okay, one more way to set up shortcuts that was not in the product, I think. No, it must have been there, but that I didn't talk about when I first did this session nearly a decade ago. And that's property editors. I love property editors. They're like mini builders. It's a feature that was added in VFP 9. And what it lets you do, no, let me say it another way. In the property sheet, the built-in stuff, if you have a property that has a limited number of values, there's a drop down. And not only that, you can double click and switch among the different items. So for example, border style, I can double click to switch among those. I'm going to set it back to its default. If it's logical, you can double click to toggle. And that's really cool, but your custom properties don't have that. Aside from that, sometimes when you've created with properties, there are things you want to do after the value gets set. And what property editors let you put all that into your properties. I'm going to create a new form, and I'm going to drag a couple of classes out of a class library that is included in the downloads. And I'm going to show you a couple of cool property editors. These are property editors I wrote for a project I'm working on that has some very specific needs. Among the needs is that labels are right aligned in this project. I guess that's not that uncommon. But what you may know if you've ever worked with right aligned labels is that right align and auto size do not get along well. So we wrote a property editor. I wrote a property editor for this project where when I come to the caption, see this button with the ellipsis, the 3 dots on it? I do that. I click it, and it said I can now type in the caption I want, and it resized my label for me. Auto size would have done that, but auto size, I say auto size and right alignment don't get along well. This one's even more interesting. Oops, didn't mean to move it. So in this project, they don't want to use checkboxes. There's a lot of heads down data entry, and checkboxes are hard to get right in heads down entry. So we built this little control. And what this little control does is it contains a label and a text box. And the text box accepts only Y and N. And you can toggle on it to switch between them. And we've got rules. The label has to end 5 characters before the text box. So I have a property of this control, this container yes, no control, called C label caption. When I set that property, I want that caption to automatically go down to the label that's contained here. And I want to resize and position things. So again, I created a property editor. I could click the ellipsis button. I can double click the property. And I can type my caption, and the whole thing gets adjusted. The caption gets resized. The text box gets moved over. So how are we doing that? These are only two of a whole bunch of property editors we've built for this project. Let's look at the label base first. When I go to the caption property, if I right-click on this property, this may not look like the right-click menu that you see in the property sheet. I've installed the PEM editor from VFPX on this machine, and so it's created a custom context menu that includes the PEM editor, but also includes the member data editor, a tool that was also added in VFP9. It's how a whole lot of stuff that was new in the property sheet is controlled. And for this particular thing, we're interested in the script here. And the script, if you've ever written a builder or looked at one, this is familiar code. It says, go out and get me an object reference to whatever is selected. In the class designer, that's the control itself, unless if nothing else is selected. I come out of this with an array of one element, which is the class that I'm working on, this label. So I grab that reference, then I prompt for the caption that I want. And if I got a caption, if they just hit cancel or leave it empty, we don't do anything. We set the label caption to what they typed in. Then I turn auto size on briefly. That will automatically resize the label. But when I turn it back off, that'll go away unless I do this line. Reset the width to itself. Now it's stored in the property. And when I reset to default auto size, the width is there. So that's how that one works. The other one has a little bit more going on. This context editor, this property editor, is for the C label caption property, a custom property. And again, I'll open the member data editor. And the first part is identical. We're just getting the reference. And we will get the container itself will be the what's in the array, and I'll grab from the container the label and the text box that are contained, prompt for the label. If we got something, set label caption to the label, but also set the label's caption property of the label. Then I'll do the same auto size trick I did in the label control to get the correct width. Then I'll say, okay, well, the text box wants to be 5 characters to the left of the label, and the label is already at position 0. So I just add 5 to that for the text box's beginning. And then the overall width I want for the container is the text box's left position plus the text box's width, because the text box begins already where I want 5 beyond the label. So a little bit of code, but it saves us so much time when we're setting these up, because we just drop the control, come to this property, right click, or not right click, double click or hit the button, and all the rest happens automatically. Very, very handy. Okay, this is a good place for me to stop and take some questions.
None to be had.
Okay, well then we'll just keep going. Cool. Let's talk about some keystrokes that make you work faster. Just a few of them. This is a trick that has been in FoxPro, I don't even know how long, but every time I demo it, some people are surprised. I'm sorry I can't see faces while I do this. I'm going to open up a few things. I'm going to reopen that container class. I might as well leave that. I'm going to reopen that code that we saw before. Okay, now suppose I come to the command window and I want to find out what folder I'm in. So I type CD, enter, but shoot, I can't see the desktop. Am I going to have to minimize all those windows? Why, no, I'm not, because I'm going to press simultaneously the Control, Shift, and Alt keys. And as long as I hold them down, I can see the desktop, and it tells me what folder I'm in. And as soon as I release them, all my windows come back. So I hope that's new to a few people. I mean, I'm sorry it's new to a few people, but I hope so. Here's one I didn't learn till I'd been doing this for a really long time. These drop downs in the method editor are type ahead. So if I start typing, I typed CL, and it took me to the first method that began with CL. I typed IN, and there's a knit, and I can just hit enter and go right there. Works in this drop down too. This one, it isn't worth it, but I'm working on some forms that have dozens of controls, and to be able to start typing there is really handy. Okay, I'm going to skip the other one here, but we'll see it in an example later. Let's talk about the debugger. There is so much to say about the FoxPro debugger, and I've said it. I've done a whole session on the debugger. You'll find the paper on my website. But I want to talk about a couple of things that really, really are handy. The first is things to put in the watch window. And I'm showing here the 3 things that are always in my watch window. The first one is the message function. That's because when I'm debugging, an error pops up and I hit suspend, and a good deal of the time I have failed to actually notice what the error message was. So in the watch window, I can see the message that I got from the most recent error. Be aware that sometimes that, like the one that's there, if it has a name in it, as you work, that name may change and no longer be accurate. I'm going to switch over because for the rest of this, I really need the debugger open. The second thing I keep in the watch window is line no. That's because not that I care what line I'm on, but line no is the easiest possible way to set a breakpoint without having to set it in advance and without having to know exactly where you want to break. Double click in the margin here. And now on the next executable line, as soon as something executes, you're going to get a breakpoint, and you'll be able to stop and look at code and do whatever it is you need to do. The third item here, you'll notice the one in here is different. The slide said get report data is in program. Here it says click is in program. The key is that I have the quotes, the $, and the program function. What I'm saying is I want to measure this. What I'm doing here also is setting breakpoints. That's really the point. If I, for example, am about to run something that's going to start with clicking a button and I want to step through it, and I haven't set a breakpoint in that method before, I use click is in program. The program function returns whatever's running. And the next piece, the next method or program that has click in the name, execution stops, and I can start tracing or do whatever it is I need to do. So these 3, I open a new installation of FoxPro. Those 3 go in the watch window immediately. By the way, kudos to Ted Roach for the line no trick. He taught me that one. Here's one that I didn't get until late in the game. The find, FoxPro's find stuff works in the debugger. So for example, I just opened a great big program, doesn't really matter what, in the trace window, and I know that the name INP fields is in it, and I can just search and find it. Now, I'll be honest, I don't use this in the trace window very much, but it turns out find works in every window of the debugger except the call stack. The one I use it in the most, locals, because I'm in the middle of tracing some code, and in the code I see some variable, like here it might be this num fields, and I want to know, I can hover over it here in the trace window if I'm actually just executing that code. But if I've had an error and the code is no longer in scope, I can go hunt in the locals window. I can hit find, type in that name, And if, there's 100 variables in the locals window, it'll find it for me. So those are really handy. That's something I use a lot. One more for debugging. And of course, I failed to show a slide. I'm not going to demo this now, but the debug out command is something I use probably every day that I am working in FoxPro. This was added when we got the new debugger in VFP 5, I think. And what it does is it sends information to the debug output window. And it has several features that make it really handy, that mean I use it way more than I use wait windows or message box. Number one, it only does something with the debugger open, but it doesn't error at runtime. So if I forget to pull this out, the end user is none the wiser. They don't see a thing unless there's an error in the debug out command, but that shouldn't happen if you've tested your code. And it can just sit there forever and it won't cause any trouble. The other thing is in this slide, it handles multiple data types. You don't have to do conversion. So I've got this debug out command on the slide with a string, then a number, then a string, then a date time, and it handles all that without any problems. Debug out is one of my best friends in FoxPro. And as I say, we'll see multiple examples in the code portion of this session. Let's move on to reports. As with the debugger, you could do, and IntelliSense, you could do a whole session. You could do multiple sessions. I haven't, but Kathy Pountney has. Some of her papers are linked in my paper. First thing is you want to set the defaults properly. There has been a long time issue with FoxPro reports that if you're not careful, information about your printer gets stored in them and causes trouble for your clients. In VFP 9, you can turn that off as a default. You uncheck Save Printer Environment in the Tools Options dialog on the Reports tab, hit Set as Default, and any report you create after that will not save printer data unless you tell it to save the printer data. What else can you do in this dialog? There's a lot here. The two I want to talk about. You can set the report engine. Are you using the old engine, the 8.0 engine, or the new one, 9.0? And you can set the default font for your reports so that if you've got a corporate standard, just set it. And then you only have to change it when you need something else. What else about reports? Conditional formatting. This is one of those holy grail things. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've answered the question or seen others answer the question. I have this data and I want to show it in a different color, in bold, in this or that or the other way in certain situations. And the way we used to tell people to do this is put two text boxes in the same place on the report and use print when to determine which one shows. You don't have to do that anymore. You have something much more sophisticated and much better if you actually need more than two conditions. So let's go take a look at that. This is VFP 9 SP2 only. And I'm going to go ahead and open up this simple report file. So this is what was on the slide, a very simple inventory report with the name of the product, whether it's in, how many are in stock. And what we're doing is we're going to show it in red if it's below the restock level. In order for me to run this report, I have to mess with the with display settings and go down to 125%. FoxPro does not play well with the report designer does not play well if you're over 125%. I'm going to print preview. So I'm using the 9.0 settings and I'm blowing this up and you can see what was on the slide. In fact, I can make that bigger. So here's our report in preview. Name of the item, how many are in stock, is it at restock? Don't ask me why the one at 0 isn't at restock level. Okay, before we go back and actually look at how this works, let me go back to display settings and go back to my 200% so you can actually read anything. Done with that. So what's going on here? So in this in stock, in the field properties, there's this new tab in SP2 called Dynamics. And in Dynamics, you can add one or more conditions. And in that condition, you can specify a property. When you create it, you give it a name. And in this case, I specified that units in stock is less than reorder level. And then you have lots of things you can do to that item. You could change the text. So perhaps you're getting data from a SQL server, and you would like, if it says null, to put something friendly that says unknown, or I don't know what else you might want to say. So you can change the actual text of the result. You can set the font, including strike-throughs and underlines. You can do what I did, set the foreground color. You can also set the default background color. You can change it opaque and transparent, and so forth. Even cooler, you can add multiple of these conditions to a given item. They're executed in the order that you see them here. That's why this is a list you can rearrange. And it works like a case statement. And that's because it is a case statement. What you put in here gets turned into a case statement. Here's my case. Case units in stock is less than reorder level. And here is what settings it sets for that. I only have the one, so we go right to the otherwise. So this is really cool, and it means that here on out, no tricks needed to do dynamic formatting. As long as you can write an expression for it and it's around content or font, you're in business. And this is another good place to stop for questions.
Richard K. and Charles Wad have related questions. Any tips or tricks for dealing with phantom breakpoints?
Oh, I wish I had the answer to that. No, I have not figured out where the phantom breakpoints come from. They've got to be hiding somewhere, but I have not solved that.
Yeah, Charles is a related question. It's his is flaky breakpoints. So
I'm not sure. I'd have to know more. Charles and I can talk about that.
Okay,
No.
that's it.
Okay, well then let us move on. Why are we? Oh, I'll bet this is courtesy of playing with display settings. Okay, so now we're ready to move on and talk about code stuff. We'll start with strings. Here's one that I keep forgetting. In VFP9, the trim function was enhanced. It used to be that all trim could do was remove spaces at one end or the other or both ends of a string. But in VFP9, I think all of 9, not just SP2, you can add a one or more parameters after the string you want to trim, saying trim these from my string. So maybe you want to trim spaces and tabs and carriage return and line feed, all of them from the ends, and you can do that. One of the ways I use this that's really handy is I often am building comma-separated lists. So here I'm going to open up Northwind. I'm going to grab the list of countries where there are customers, and then I am going to scan through that and build a comma-separated list. So each time I take the existing string, I add the new item, and then I add a comma space at the end. But as everybody here knows, that means when I'm done, there's this extra comma space at the end. Here's how you get rid of it. You use trim, pass see all countries, the variable you want to trim, and tell it to trim the exact string, comma space, off of the end. So that is cool. And I'm going to add, because I didn't do it here. I thought of this when I was rehearsing the other day, but I didn't do it. Let me move the debug up. And let's take a look at the string before we debug too. Okay. Notice how I'm using Debug Out here to let me demo this, except what did I do wrong? Oh, because I said debug instead of Debug Out. Yeah, cancel that. That's better. That's what happens when you change things on the fly in a session. So here in our Debug Out window, first we have the string that we created with the loop, and it's hard to see, but right here at the end, there's comma and space. And then we trimmed it, and there isn't anymore. I got to remember that's there because I had actually forgotten. Let's talk about perhaps my favorite function that got added to VFP along the way. This came in VFP 6 and got better in VFP 7. I'm talking about A-lines, your all-purpose parser. When A-lines was added in VFP 6, the idea was it was going to be able to break a string up into lines and put one line in each element of an array. Well, that's nice. But we all said, but what we mostly want to break up isn't really lines, it's other stuff. And people came up with code where they could substitute something for the carriage return line feed, use A-lines, and then substitute back the line break, and that was handy. So in VFP 7, they gave us the extra parameters we need to specify what we want to separate by. So even though it's still called A-lines, in your head, you should think of it as a parse. Parse whatever I give you into an array, and I use this all the time. It's also really fast. It is faster than any of the other methods of parsing in VFP. And it's linear. As the string it's parsing gets longer, this time it takes with A-lines goes up only with the length of the string. So imagine you have this variable C list that has the comma-separated list of colors. So we're going to use A-lines, pass the array to put it in, pass the variable, and then I say, my separator is a comma. And I've got to use my other trick, Control-Alt-Shift. And there's the array that I created with one of those strings in each element. And from there, I could drop it into a cursor. You'll see an example of that later in the session, and so forth. I often find that I use A-lines first to break something into lines, and then I use it again to break the lines up into individual elements of the lines. I write a lot of code like that. Also in VFP 6, we got these great functions, file to string and string to file, that let us, respectively, grab a file and put the entire content of the file into a character variable, or take a character variable and write it out to a file, and you can do that additively. So I've ended up writing a whole lot of logging classes, or one logging class that I vary. This is the simplest version, I think. We have a custom logger. It has a parameter, a property to hold the name of the file, and a method called logit. Logit receives a string and an optional logical that says, should we start a new file? If it's true, if it's false, which is the default, then we will just add on to the existing file. In this version of the logger, we'll create the log on the fly. I'm throwing it into my temp folder. And what do I do to log something? I turn the date time into a character, put that and a colon at the beginning, then put the string I've been asked to log, then carriage return line feed, throw that into the log file, inverse of whether to start, because the parameters are backward. This version also has a simple show log method where if there is a file, I'm going to modify file. And at the top of this example, I'm going ahead and using that. Use your imagination in here, that where every comment here is big blocks of code. There's some process and I want to see each step happening. So I instantiate the logger, and then I call log it and pass something. The first time I pass true for the second parameter because I want to create a new log file, or I want to start fresh in the log file. The others are all going to be additive, and then I'm going to show you the file. Of course, they didn't have to just be fixed strings. Here's my output, by the way. There could have been variables or fields in these things. I do have to convert everything to string. It's not as friendly as Debug Out, but I use a simple logger like this all over the place. Sometimes, though, having written such a log, I find that I want to grab stuff back out of it and be able to see it individual lines or even put them into a cursor to do something. So here's an example of file to string. We're going to find out what log we're interested in. And if it's not empty, if we got something, I'm going to use file to string to read it all into a variable. Then I'm going to use A lines to break that up into lines, create a cursor for that, and insert the contents of the array into a cursor. Oops, that was not what I meant to do. And when I run that, it's going to prompt me. This is not the log we just created, so I probably shouldn't use it. Let's go find the log we just created. It's in temp. It's in users. I got to go find my temp folder. Users, Tamar, app data, local, temp, and there's our log. And here we go. And here's a bonus tip. If you want to see what's in a memo field, just hover the mouse over it. One place I use code like this is with the output from the coverage tool. It creates these logs, and you have the coverage profiler, but I don't always want to do what the profiler wants. I've written a bunch of code to deal with the content of the coverage log. So I use file to string to read it in, and I break it up and throw it into a cursor, and I can do all kinds of stuff with it there. Okay. How about dates and times? Dates and times are cool. FoxPro has always had date math. As far back as I can remember, you could take a date and add a number to it, and it would give you the date that many days later and so forth. But there are some cool things, some even more cool things, because that's cool. First is that somewhere along the way, I think it was VFP 6, but I wouldn't swear to it, date and date time, the function, started accepting parameters to let you specify a specific date. If you call date by itself, you get today's date. But if you call date like this with a year, month, and day, you get a specific date. In that case, my birth date. And you can do cool tricks with that. For example, I could take that birth date, grab only the year portion, and then use the date function to create another date, which is that year, but January 1st. The other thing that we've had, and I think this is since FoxPro 2.0, is the go month function, which says take a given date and go forward or backward a given number of months. Here, I'm going to use that function to build the last day of the month of the birth date that was specified. So I take the birth date, I subtract the number of days in the birth date. That takes you back to the last day of the previous month. I add 1, that takes you to the first day of the same month of that original date. I go 1 month forward, that takes me to the last day, the first day of the next month, and subtract 1 from that takes me to the last day of the month of the original date. Some of you may be wondering, why didn't I just write go month, dbirth, minus day of dbirth, comma 1? The problem is the months have different lengths. And so if, for example, the original date was in March, then that would take me back to February 28th or 29th, depending on the year. And a month forward from that is going to be the 28th or 29th of March, not the 31st. So we go backward to the last day of the previous month, forward to the first of the month we're interested in, Forward a month from there, subtract 1 to get the last of the month. So let's run these. And again, notice how I'm using Debug Out to show you the result. I said there'd be lots of examples. So the first day of the birth year for 9/28/58 is 1/1/58. Yup. Last day of month for 9/28/58 is 9/30/58. Also yup. Let's talk about program structure. And I'm going to skip quite a bit here. Let's start with counting parameters, because this is one where I think a bunch of folks still don't know this. And that is that the parameters function that has been in FoxPro forever, I don't really know when it came in, is flaky. What it tells you is not the number of parameters that were passed to the current routine, but the number of parameters passed in the last call to a custom routine. Fortunately, in the stuff that was added in FoxPro 2.6 that came out of DBase, there's a function called pcount. And pcount always tells you the number of parameters passed to the routine where you use it. Let's go see the example. So I've written some really simple code. I have a main routine, turn on the debugger, and call a routine called subproc passing 2 parameters. Subproc accepts those parameters and then sends to the debug output window some information, including a call to parameters and a call to pcount. Then we're going to call a routine called subproc. And when we come back from that, we're going to do the same thing again, call parameters and call pcount. Note that we're not passing any parameters to subproc. Subproc doesn't actually do anything. So let's run this. So immediately on entry to subproc, they both return 2. But after we've called subproc, parameters return 0 and pcount returns 2. My general advice here is never use parameters again. Every time you see it in your code, change it to pcount. In fact, use Go Fish and change parameters to pcount everywhere that you're using it. Let's talk about loops a little bit. FoxPro has 4 different looping constructs: do while, scan, for, and for each. I'm going to start with the do while, scan, and for. Here's what you need to know. For is an order of magnitude faster than do while. If you have a counted loop, you should always use for, not do while. Scan is faster than do while, not a whole order of magnitude, but under almost every circumstance, it's faster. Scan also does a lot of extra work for you. It remembers the work area. It goes to the next record. If you are looping through records, you should always use scan rather than do while not into file. That means that do while should only be for loops that are not counted and are not looping through records. Then there's for each. For each was added in VFP 5. It's specifically for collections, though it works on arrays. And what it does is let you go through a collection and easily grab a reference to the current object in the collection. So instead of having to say for n equals 1 to collection.count, O object equals collection of n, you just say for each O object in collection, and then you immediately have in O object that object, and it's great. And in general, it's going to be faster than for. There's one situation where you should never use for each, and that is if you are removing objects from the collection inside the loop. In that case, you should use a for loop and count backwards. Start with the last one to 1, step -1, because as you remove objects from the collection, for each isn't going to notice you've done so, and you're going to miss things. One more thing about for each that's really big motivation for why I'm talking about it. When it was added in VFP5, FoxPro did not have native collections, but it had COM collections. It had projects and files, and you could talk to automation servers. So you could talk to the Word documents collection and so forth. And that's really why for each was added. But in VFP8, we got native collections. We have our own FoxPro collections. And in VFP8, we noticed that for each didn't work very well with our native collections. So in VFP9, we got a new keyword, Fox object. The issue as what's going on is when you use for each without Fox object, the object that it creates in item here is a COM object. And COM objects behave differently in VFP than native objects. We're going to demo that because I'm going to create a very simple collection. Create a collection and add a few items. I have a cus item class down here that's about as simple as it gets. It has 2 custom properties, and the init method accepts 2 parameters and sets those properties. It, of course, because it's based on custom, has all the other properties that custom would normally have. So we expect that if we check how many items are in that item, how many members, how many PEMs an item in this collection has, there should be some. But what we'll see is if we don't use the Fox object keyword, we don't get any because it's a COM object, and COM objects can't tell FoxPro about their members until you touch them. It's kind of weird. Let's go run this because it'll make more sense. So, well, the first loop for each of our 3 objects, it says there are no PEMs. The second time, it says there are 34, which seems more realistic. The moral of the story is if you are working with a native FoxPro collection, if it's a collection using the FoxPro collection class, then add the Fox object keyword to your for each loop. Not only does it make things behave right, it's also faster. Let's talk OOP. There are obviously lots of things I could say. I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One is I often find in the code I write that I need to turn a name into an object reference. That is, I have the name of a property, the name of an object that's part of something like a control on a form, and I want an object reference to that thing. We'll see an example in just a minute. What I do, the way I do it is with the eval function. If you put eval and the name of the thing that it contains, oform dot as a string, plus the name, the variable that has the name of the one you want, eval will turn that into an object reference. As I say, we'll see that in this example. One of the things you want to do when you're working in OOP, you have forms and things running, is you want to be able to find what's in a particular place. And we have 2 different functions that do that, amouseObj and sys1270. They're not the same. AmouseObj lets you say, tell me about the object under the mouse. Except it actually accepts parameters. So you can also say, tell me about the object at this point. You get back an array, and the array contains an object reference to the object under the mouse or at the specified point, an object reference to that object's container, and then the point itself. So let's go take a look at that. I have a form, and where do I get to the right? It doesn't show up. We're going to look at the way that I have dealt with a particular grid peculiarity. In grids, the tooltip that you get if you hover over a grid, is the one for the grid, not the one for the column or the control in the column. But wait. Oh, right. My notes even say I have to close all tables. But did I? Let's run that form again. And if I hover here, hey, it says street address. But if I hover here, it says company name. And if I have, well, there's that one, city name, and so on. I did it for a few of them. But I just said that grids give you the tooltip of the grid, not the tooltip of what you're over. So in this grid class, which is included in the session materials, I have written some code in the tooltip text access method. This will fire when you hover over the grid. And what I do is set the tip to empty, and I use a mouse obj, get back an array of where is my mouse. And what you will get over a grid is a column. I check, though. This shouldn't run unless I'm over the grid and over a column, but I double check that I got something and that it's a column. And I go ahead and say, does this column have a tooltip? If so, grab it. But maybe there's a tooltip for the text box or whatever control is in the grid. So here's that trick I was just talking about with a vowel. To get an object reference, I take O column dot, that's my column, and I add O column dot current control, the name of the current control in that column. I evaluate that, and I get an object reference to that control. And if it has a tooltip, I grab the tooltip for that. And whichever one I got, I return it. If this were really thorough, I'd probably be initializing here to the grid's tooltip text, not making it empty. That would be better code. Okay, so that's, and we saw how it works. That's Sys 1270. I'm sorry, that's a mouse ob. Sys 1270 will give you an object reference to whatever is under the mouse. It has one thing about it that's really annoying, which is if you are not over something that it can grab a reference to, instead of returning null, it returns false. So you must check the return value. I know that a lot of people have code like this that they run as part of their startup. Set a key label, and so something O or OOBS or whatever you want it to be is Sys 1270. I'll run that. And now if I reopen that form, I'll do it at design time. And I now hit F11. If I come down here, I can and type O and hit dot. It's going to show me IntelliSense for whatever this is. And we can find out what it is by saying O.name, return, use my Control Shift Alt again, column 5. That's what I expected. I said it would be over a column. So that's pretty cool. Speaking of IntelliSense and typing, release O, not I, O. IntelliSense is really handy when you're writing code, not just in the command window. And you can turn on IntelliSense that you might not otherwise have by declaring things as what they are. So if I declare local O form as form, then in this window, when I type O form and dot, up pops my IntelliSense for a standard form. Doesn't have to be a standard form. I could declare local O form as my form class of my form library. And then when I type O form dot, I'm going to get IntelliSense for that class. This works for automation objects too. Local O word as word dot. And if I wait long enough, well, maybe not. Maybe I don't have that turned on here. But if I make it word dot application, then down here, and I will have to wait a moment while it loads that library, now I have IntelliSense for Word. And this all works not just for declarations, But for the with command, if I say with a word as word dot, and see, now I have it because I loaded it. Then in here, I can say dot, and there's my IntelliSense for a word. Very handy. Okay, and we'll finish up with a few miscellaneous items that didn't really fit any of the other categories. Number 1, in the copy to command, do not ever, ever, ever use type XLS. Type XLS is Excel 2.0. If you want to create an Excel, you want to copy to type XL5, which is okay, or type CSV, which Excel treats like a native file. Next one, name expressions came in really, really early. FoxPro's had macros as long as I've been using it, the ampersand operator, and it's handy. And the macro is really great when you have something where there's just no other way to do it. But any command where what FoxPro expects is a name rather than an expression, if you put the variable that contains the name in parentheses, that's called a name expression, and it's a better way to do it than macros. Why? First, it's marginally faster. On today's machines, I don't think that's huge. But here's an example. I'm going to prompt for a file name to make a copy, an XLS. I'm actually doing XL5, but to do to make a copy of the Northwind employee file. If I got something, first I'm going to try to do it with ampersand, and I'll tell you if it worked. Then I'll do it with the parenthesis for a name expression. We're going to get a bonus tip here that's in the paper, but I didn't show you. I used the get file earlier to get a file, and it changed the default. I want to go back to my folder. If I type CD and choose my folder here, then when this code runs with put file, it's going to start in the folder I'm in. And yes, that's what I want. And it's going to ask me if I want to overwrite it. I do. So the copy using macro failed because, and here's the error message, command contains unrecognized phrase or keyword. But the copy using the name expression succeeded. So what happened there? New file had the name of my current folder, which if we come back to the command window, you can see has an embedded space in it. So the copy to command, as soon as it finds that space, it thinks that's the end of the file name. And then there's all this extraneous garbage. It doesn't know what it is in the command. So always, if you can use a name expression, use a name expression. And one more, and then I'll take questions. Because this is one that, again, something came in later. Actually, two more, sorry. The first is the type command was expanded in VFP 9 to let you check for arrays. There is an optional second parameter of 1. And if you type of something, comma 1, it will tell you either U for undefined, meaning it's not an array, or A for an array. Quick example. Up here, I declare three variables, including an array. I initialize the scalar variables. The array, since I didn't initialize, is full of false. So I'm going to use Debug Out to check the type of each thing. Then I'll do it with the optional second parameter, comma 1, to find out, are these arrays? And lo and behold, nval is numeric, cval is C, A-list, the array is L because the first element is logical. But when I check if they're arrays, the first two are not, and the third one is. Another of those things that came along and you might not have noticed. And one more where I'm not even going to show you an example, but we'll just talk about it. You may be familiar with NVL function, which means non-null value. You pass it two parameters. If the first parameter is not null, it returns the first parameter. If the first parameter is null, it returns the second parameter. Late in the game, I think VFP 8, but I'm not sure, we got a corresponding function for empty values. EVL, you pass two parameters. If the first parameter is not empty, it returns the first parameter. If the first parameter is empty, it returns the second parameter. Really handy. One of those things that makes code more readable, and you can combine the two so that you can check for both nulls and empty values and specify what you want if there's no value. Okay. Are there more questions?
Yes, there are. Is there a benefit to using type function over var type function?
Only this array thing. Frankly, I use var type everywhere that I can. I use type only in places where I can't be sure the thing exists.
Okay. That's it.
Okay. So what did we learn? We learned that there are lots of ways to work faster, smarter, and better with VFP. I didn't talk about it explicitly, and I will say one of the things I miss most in this COVID virtual era is the ability to look over people's shoulder and see what they're doing, because I learned so much watching other people work, even if it isn't the way that I want to work. The last time we did this, I learned something from Rick's session that let me turn something off that had been annoying me for the longest time. I mentioned a couple of times VFPX and the community tools that are out there. Absolutely check those. They will make you better at what you do. There's something there that you're not using that when you start using it, you're going to say, why? Why didn't I use this all these years? So thank you very much. Please fill out your evaluations. I learned from them and we as a group learned from them. I will be doing a Q&A session immediately following this, and I thank you all very much.